Good evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and call this regular November 19th, 2018 Charter Review Committee meeting to order. Can we begin with an approval of the agenda as was noticed?
So moved.
I have a motion and a second. Any suggestions, changes to the motion, or to the agenda? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Everybody take a second to look at your October 15th minutes. And if anybody had caught any typos, has a different memory of how those items went, let us know now and we can correct that.
Or you talking about Article 3?
No, I'm looking at the minutes from October 15th, so it's right here. As soon as you guys are good with them, we'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Okay, I have a motion to approve the minutes and a second. Anybody last minute? All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion passes unanimously. All right, Article 3, the mayor. I think we have done an excellent job of trimming this article. I think we've cut out more than half of it. Everybody just take a couple seconds, look through, make sure there are some, and the way I'm reading these is if it is underlined, it's an addition. If it was struck through, they pulled it out. If it's highlighted, they have some questions about it, right, that they want to bring to our attention. So in Section 8, it says, have maintained a primary principal and physical residence. Right, we talked a lot about what counts as that. Rich, you want to remind us of that conversation?
Right. The gist of that was that as a matter of law, it's really kind of an impossible task to define what this what the term residence means. And so we made the note just to sort of consolidate it. It's really a state of mind, and it can be a fact or a case-by-case basis. And so our recommendation is to try not to go down the road of defining it here, because all it's going to do is raise more questions. You know, we candidly tell you that without the definition, obviously it's raising questions as well, but it's really the state of mind and sort of looking at the person in good faith, what that person intended as far as that person's residence. And so that's sort of what we're getting at with the comment there, and I know that there was discussion on whether we should define it, and legal's recommendation is that we should not go down that road in the charter.
I'll agree. Everybody comfortable with the wording as it states? Well,
So
we
are
had,
we leaving this?
hang on.
Okay.
That would be the idea
Okay.
of leave it the way it's written here if we're about to vote on that right now. So
But you're saying in the state of mind, though, you're saying leave this in here as it is?
As
we're
it is.
Going down a legal road?
Right.
Okay.
And also it's probably important to keep in mind too, this would apply with our discussion on old business and new business here. Just because we make a decision today, we may even approve something by motion, that is not necessarily in concrete, so to speak. As we get into this and maybe look at some other sections, it may spur some additional thoughts that we had on prior sections. And so we want to revisit those if that comes up. But for purposes of today, this is how we have it. And I think in general, the other thing I want to point out, when we're looking at the mayor, Article 3, and the city commission, which we'll get into in Article 4, we want the board to understand that what we have in here are not necessarily recommendations. I can give you some input on what I think works and doesn't work, but it's also intended to open up some discussion and kind of show the board what's being used, what has been used in other places, not necessarily across the board, but we're sort of putting things out there just for some discussion and make this sort of a collaborative process. So I think that's important with both the mayor section. When we get into it, the city commission, we can talk about some of those things later on. But we don't want to mislead, legal does not want to mislead everyone into thinking this is the way it should be. You know, it's open for discussion just as much today as it was when we met last month on these exact same issues. But to summarize, the one change in here that is really different from what we saw a month ago is in that section 7, and that is where we talked about when the mayor would actually take office.
Before you move to that, Rich,
Okay.
Walt had a question about section 8, I think was your
Okay.
question.
Correct,
So before we
correct.
move on from that.
Yeah, while we were still on 8. Would it be feasible or prudent to end that sentence or at least that section where it says primary, principal, and physical residence within the said city, make it within said city limits? Because when I lived outside of the city limits, I still lived in Newberry.
No, well, for discussion purposes, I would say no, because that's what we were just talking about. When you say city limits, there's still people outside the city limits that go to school here, work here. Their mailing addresses in the city or in the Newberry, everything is still Newberry. So then that goes back to that bona fide stuff. Instead of hindering somebody, that you could go back and say, the city limit's right here, and you can't run for anything.
So you're talking about you live within the city limits, but in unincorporated area of the city
Yeah, I
limits.
lived within Newberry, out on Southwest 46.
But it was an unincorporated
But it was
parcel.
unincorporated. It wasn't within the city
Yes.
limits.
Then you wouldn't be allowed to run.
That was before I moved in the
Right.
city limits. But, I mean, is there a way to clarify that? Because that just says city.
Mr. Manager?
I mean, the city attorney is more qualified to weigh in, but my 2 cents is if you say within the city limits, that clearly means you have to be a resident
Within the city limits.
within incorporated area. My belief is to say you live in the city but I'm not in the city limits is kind of a misnomer. That means you live in the Newberry community, the greater Newberry area, but you're not an incorporated Newberry. If you say in the city limits or in incorporated Newberry, it is clearly on dirt that has been annexed into the city.
Well,
I
that's
think
what
it's a
I'm
good
talking about
clarification.
is trying to define that instead of just an ambiguous within, or where it says within said city.
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of define that a little bit more, because the city limits, I mean, we have a specific area that.
You're talking, you're addressing the little pockets that have it incorporated.
Correct.
But I think if you say that you have to live within the city, that means that you have to be on incorporated.
I'm just trying to take away any challenges to that verbiage.
Because the whole idea is that I pay city taxes, I have a vested interest in how the city is run because I'm a member of the city. So if I'm on an unincorporated pocket inside the city, I don't have that same. But no legal, and Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, no legal entity would recognize me as being a city of Newberry.
That's correct. We can make that clarification. I mean, it's a good point you make. It also brings up probably a lesser point to be made on this, but in speaking with city staff about the city commission, Article 4, one of the things we removed in that section was reference to said city as well. The word said city, we know what city we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But so I would recommend that we actually remove that word as well, but we'd be happy to.
Remove said and add limits, or however we can define the city boundary.
Right,
Is-
we could certainly do that.
Within incorporated Newberry or
Mhm.
something, some
So
terminology like that.
what we'll do is we'll do another red line. We'll add this section to old business for the next meeting too, with that specific change.
Well, does the board agree that we need to
I got
push that language further? Are you comfortable with within the city?
Is it gonna bring up a legal challenge?
I mean, these kinds of issues have always been,
Yeah, that's.
but they're
been there
so hard to
forever.
prove.
Right.
You know, so it's,
Regardless of the language, there have been legal challenges.
Right.
They're
Yeah.
hard to prove, so.
yeah. So I mean, I don't want to task legal with, if y'all are fine with the city, I don't want them spending 20 minutes, 30 minutes trying to figure out how do I incorporate, make it clear to say an incorporated parcel within the city. But if you guys, if you agree, I've never had that specific. People who challenge this, they challenge it for other reasons. You know, they're not in the city of Newberry, or, you know, there was one thing that I meant to bring up last time about this, and it did happen one time where someone was on active military service, and they came back and wanted to run for office, but they hadn't been in the city of Newberry. They lived in the city of Newberry their entire life. They left there, did their service. Then they came back and the election was right there. They couldn't run because they had, you know, lived in Iraq for 4 years, and they'd only lived in Newberry now for 5 years since they lived in Iraq. Is there, Rich, a way, I mean, all that person did was wait a year to run again, so it's not like they were eliminated, but is there a way to address that potential issue if I come back, if I can show that my lack of residency is because of military service?
Well, again, I sort of circle back to the fact that we're recommending in this case that we don't get too far into the weeds on defining residence, because I do think we you know, I mean, military, I mean, we could make some exceptions, but then where do we draw the line? And we're starting to get into, you know, how many other
that person
exceptions
could
should we-
have said, you know, my residence is my parents' house, and it was for the last 4 years. Every time I came home, I lived in my parents' house, and that would have counted.
Don't just say 6 months. Is that what
You have to live here for 6 months, right? But he had only been back from Iraq for 4 months.
Right, so he
and
don't
so he
qualify.
couldn't run. But what I'm saying is he could have said, well, my principal residence in Newberry was my parents' house. I got my mail there.
I think
when
we
I
need
came
to leave
home.
this almost as broad as possible, and then for something like that, handle it on a case-by-case basis.
You know.
I mean, I think changing it from said city to the city would handle what we need it to
Fine.
handle at this point.
I agree.
And
It
then
was
if we
just
needed
that
to cut
I didn't
hairs
mean to
later, I
bring
say
it
we
up.
leave that up to legal. That's not something the commission's gonna decide on, right?
Well, and people, I mean, we've had people run, and all they did was rent a room from somebody one time, you know. So I think leave it, you know, everybody knows the intent of this, and it's up to you and your moral ethical code about what you want to do with it, you know.
Yeah.
Everybody head shake on that. Okay, Rich, you had something to say about section 7?
Well, section 7, we added in some language as far as when the mayor shall take office. You'll see some new language in there. On the 10th calendar day after the election, or as soon as practical thereafter, but no later than 30 days. Which I think,
This better, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I think that captures where we were going with this discussion last month. And we didn't necessarily want it immediate because there could be some challenges and that sort of thing. But at the same time, you don't want it to linger forever. So we put a 30-day cap on that for the board's consideration.
Good?
I'm good with that one.
Good. Okay, so you guys got anything else to bring our attention to in Article 3?
Beyond that, everything else that's in here would be the items or issues that we brought to the attention of the board last month. So I don't know that I have anything new to add.
Okay, so the board members have anything that they, in looking over the suggested revisions, that you wanted to bring attention to? Okay, all ready to entertain a motion?
I move we pass Article 3 with the change of said to the.
Okay. I have a motion and a second. Any questions, comments on the motion on the floor? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. All right, new business. This is where we always get to have all the good conversations. Article 4, City Commission. Rich, do you want to take us through this? Do you want the board members to kind of start at the beginning with the questions that they have? How did you want to
Well, maybe
efficiently?
if you don't mind, Mr. Mayor, I could make some sort of introductory comments.
Please.
And then maybe we can go from there. But again, this is where I want to make very clear that the city attorney and city staff here is really not advocating in any way that we go in one direction versus another. Really what we've tried to do, what we've tried to accomplish here is identify anything that needs cleanup work first and foremost, kind of the lower hanging fruit, and then some of the more substantive provisions we have tried to pull from other charters, other examples, and either include them for purposes of talking about them, considering them, and we can kind of go through the mechanics of some of those things, or in the margins occasionally we will pose a question, which is really, we're not even sure that it's worth trying to propose language on anything until the board has an opportunity to sort of vet an issue and see which direction everyone
Sure.
might be headed on things. So
Was that the end of the introduction, or?
that I can end there.
Okay, well, I was going to suggest that because you guys have an awful lot in this one, that we go just paragraph by
Okay.
paragraph through this. And taking everything you just said into consideration, that these are all just research study points that you guys have found, and then we'll just go through them point by point.
Okay, so I think that makes sense. And if we look at section 13, a lot of what is done there is really to conform to Article 3 when we're talking about the mayor. So again, that's my example of sort of cleaning up things, making things consistent, sort of the easier.
I think the question there, it has been what is the length of term? There have been a couple of city commissioners that have floated the idea of a 3-year term. I think everybody is kind of off of a 4-year term, but they have asked this board to consider a 3-year term. And I think there's a couple of questions there. One, if you're not willing to consider a 3-year term at all, then the other two questions go away. If you are willing to consider a 3-year term, then it's how would that play out? You could do 2-2-2, and you still have an election every single year. You could take a year off, which would save a little bit of money. Those kinds of things. So I think I held the question until we got here. Whatever you put in for the commission would obviously also apply to the mayor. But at some point, we're going to have to consider whether or not we want to even float that idea, or if we just want to say to the commission that we don't think it's a good idea and we would recommend you moving forward without it.
Well,
Board Member Clark, go ahead.
I personally had talked about this during the elections, and sometimes it would give us a break in the city from having elections every year. And if we did this, I recommended, and I know there's some disapproval on both sides, but I wanted to see a 3-year and then have it 3 and 2. That way we do have a year off. Because some people get tired of being worn out on the voting, and it's yearly, and they're constantly, and then you get the federal in there too, and then you got more elections than you can handle. So, personally, I would like to see it.
Okay, Jim?
I've been coming to the meetings for a long time, for many, many years, and I've seen a number of commissioners move in and out of this commission. And I really would like to stick with the 2-year term. You want to be able to have the option to move commissioners in and out over the years. Granted, there are some people that are really good at it, but if we end up with a disaster, you don't want to have to live with that for 3 years.
Other thoughts?
Yes.
Paul?
And actually, because the mayor's race is in there as well, it wouldn't be 3 and 2 and then a break. It would be 3 and 3, and then because the mayor still has to run as well.
He would.
You can still structure where there would be a year
Yeah,
off.
you could put it.
Yeah.
You'd put him in with.
Okay. But I don't want to burden the community with basically an election every year for 3 years. I mean, do it 1 year, give everybody a break. Then you got the next year, give everybody a break.
I'm not quite sure I'm
Oh,
understanding
wait a
what
minute,
you're
no,
saying.
because it would
won't do
still
that.
be, you still have them.
You could
every
structure
year.
it where every 2 years you'd have 1 year off. If you had 4-year terms, then you could have where you
Yeah.
get a break, but I don't think anyone's considering that.
No.
So at 3 years, the best you could do is get 1 year off every 2 years. Mark, you had a thought down there about, are you still just listening?
Oh, no, I'm just listening to
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm actually pretty neutral on this. I mean, I understand the idea of having a year off. I would say I'll be real quick. The one, I think, advantage to structuring, it wouldn't give you the year off, but to structuring 2-2-2 is that you wouldn't have a majority of the commission flip in 1 year, which would mean that if you've got something that you're, a large project that you're working on, that project would have some amount of insulation politically. Because right now, if something's going on and it happens to fall on the year where 3 commissioners are up and 3 commissioners flip, now the majority of your board changes direction, and that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. It happened about 4 years ago. We were on a path to be the North Central Florida sports destination, and we were making some progress that way, and the community said, we're tired of that destination, we want to go a different all 3 of those board members flipped, and sports tourism took a back seat, and we went in a different direction. So, that would be just one other thing. It wouldn't give you the year off. Elections, Miss Judy, are about $5,000, $6,000 for us to hold. So it's not a tremendous amount of savings that you get by taking that year off. I think this emotional, psychological, there's that little break every once in a while is probably more important. But just throwing that out there, like I say, I don't really have strong feelings one way or the other. Ms. Bonnie, did you want to weigh in? I'm not sure where Walt was.
I'm kind of torn. As a voter, I get tired of voting every year. It's so aggravating, and I'm sure people get tired of running. It feels like you're constantly running, I'm sure, for a 2-year term. But then I also think of what Jim was saying. I mean, when you got good ones, it's great. But when you don't, and you're stuck with them for another year at this point, I'm really torn. At this moment in time, I'm torn. I definitely do not want to do 4. But I'm not strongly opined either way at this point.
Mark?
Jim, and I just wanted to, and I understand what you're talking about when you got good or bad, but when you get a new commissioner, their first year is learning.
Right.
And you don't know they're good or bad before then you got 1 year. So to me, it's not the extra year is not a big deal when you're talking about the commission, and just food for thought. Because this first year is a learning curve for everybody.
For a year off.
So,
Right, and there's that too.
Yeah.
I see that.
so just something to,
You'd do 3, and a year off. So it'd still stay the same structure, but you'd have a year off in there. Because once I get elected for that 3rd year, there'd be an interim year there where nobody was up. I mean, one of the things I think, and why it was so great to get somebody from every walk of Newberry up here, because if this body says, I think I can argue for 3 years, then I think the town argues for 3 years. I think if this body says 2 years, then I think that's what the town would say, 2 years. And that was intentionally done, was to try to make sure that we get all of these opinions up here and hashing them out. I mean, I think that if you run for office, you are taking on the responsibility and obligation of running for office, whatever the deal is. So if it's a 2-year deal, then I'm signing up for it. I know what I'm signing up for. We had one really nasty election 3 or 4 years ago. Other than that, I think Newberry is generally pretty polite when it comes to elections. Compared to other folks, compared to other areas.
Compared to other
She obviously
Let's
disagrees.
go with that. Let's go with
Yeah.
compared to other areas.
I mean, in my experience with the
There have
7
been
years,
several ugly
Yeah.
elections here.
but and everybody that runs really feels whatever happens to them is really egregious. But after watching a bunch of these and watching other areas around us, I would say Newberry is generally fairly polite.
Oh, I didn't even
relatively.
mean the one that we ran in.
Yeah.
I meant even 10 years ago.
Oh, no, I'm not
I
saying
mean,
we
there were
haven't
some
had our
really ugly
share.
ones.
But my point is that, I know there's an emotional toll that comes with having to run every year. But I don't want anybody to think that we didn't ask for it. We signed up for it. We knew what we were getting into. So it's really this question in my mind of, and to Mark's point, I would say it takes you 2 years to really learn everything, especially since lately we've had a lot of candidates that run who haven't done things like this, haven't served on boards, haven't participated in a way. They just kind of jumped in. And if you didn't serve on a lot of boards, then there's a big learning curve about the issues that are going on. Some of you guys could sit on the dais tomorrow and be right on because you've been so involved in so many ways. It wouldn't take much to catch you up on things. For other folks, a 2-year term, by the time I'm running again, I've just figured out what I'm supposed to be doing. So.
But I know that when several people heard that I was doing charter review, the first thing out of their mouths were, do not let them pass more than 2-year commission appointments. That they were very concerned with that. And I know it's been voted on in the past and hasn't passed. And so they're worried about getting a clunker and being stuck for 3-4 more years.
You still can't, you just won't. Unless you get 3 clunkers.
I know,
Yeah.
but
Then you take it to the minimum.
Another
but they were
advantage,
really concerned. So and it
another
was like
advantage
a
of the
cross-section.
3-year terms that I can see is you don't have to, right after you start, you're still learning, you don't have to jump right back out there and start running again. And you get to focus on what's going on here for at least 2 years before you have to consider running again. So, it does buy you time as a commissioner to actually focus and learn what's going on without having to immediately turn around and run.
Also, running in Newberry, it's just not that hard. We have a debate, and you kind of show up at a few events, but it's just not that hard running in Newberry.
Can I make Jessica's face to that one? I can't make Jessica's face as good as Jessica make it. But if you've ever run in Newberry, not as hard as running a countywide election, but it sure will wear your feet out running in this town.
It definitely is work running in Newberry.
We do not have to come to a decision here tonight, guys, but at some point we will have to come to a decision because this is something that was specifically asked of this board by the commission, was what do you guys think? And it sounds to me like we have the full range of opinion up here, which is good, that we have some who are adamantly opposed, some who think it's a good idea, and some who want to think about it a little bit more. Did you want to weigh in, Ms. Gale, or are you sitting still thinking on it?
No, I'm not. I'm leaning toward the, I'm not for 4 years, but I am leaning more toward the 2 years. Because my thinking is on the same line as Mark. As far as getting someone in that may not really work out, and I think it would be best to get them out as soon as possible, and 2 years would be there.
Okay. Do you guys want to continue talking about it and vote on this part tonight, or do you want to sleep on it more and think about it? I got
Mr.
one
Mayor,
person
if
shaking
you
their
don't
head.
mind, I'd
Rich?
like to add some comments.
Sure, please do.
It's in a roundabout way, give you my opinion on what should be done tonight. First of all, when you look at Section 13, it does say for a term is provided for in this charter. And so to put that into context, that is actually discussed in Article 7, elections, which will be coming up. That's where in specifically Section 43, that's where the 2-year term is written in. So that is coming up. It's
So we have
really-
more time.
We have more time, but I do very much appreciate the discussion on this tonight, because this is what we had anticipated as being one of the more contested issues. Lots of different opinions that we've all heard here tonight. So this, I mean, you've got a couple months to chew on this and really think about this provision. We really emphasize that you should really think about that. The other part of it, too, is we surveyed a handful of the other municipalities in the state of Florida, and we found terms for as much as 4 years. That doesn't mean that that's the sort of the majority of what the municipalities are doing, but 3 years is not unheard of. 4 years is not unheard of. Just some food for thought. The other thing we'd point out too here is that this might be one of those issues, probably there'll be a half a dozen of them by the time we're done with this whole process, that you can go in so many different ways. You can imagine the voters would go in so many different ways, that we would actually suggest considering this as a standalone issue. Because keep in mind, when we have the voters go to the polls on this, this is an all or nothing charter unless we do a standalone provision. This might be one of those things.
That's the only thing I feel passionate about.
Okay.
My main concern is changing the term limits causes people to vote no, where they liked everything else.
Yeah.
And they vote no on all this work because of that one thing. So as long as we can do it as a standalone, but I think this board is going to be the mouthpiece that goes out into the community and says to the community, this is a good charter, and you should vote yes. Or you're going to say, this is a good charter, but it's got that piece in there, and you're going to be the advocates against it, because that's where people fall. They either support something or they work against something, right?
Can I ask you a question about that? So, like, in a case like this where we want to change some of the other language, how would that work? Would we have part of it in there where it changes, like, the language where on the 10th calendar day that's included in the rest of the charter changes, and then the part with that's contentious that we're changing out as a standalone?
I don't know if this quite answers your question, but ideally, what we would like to have is one vote on a charter from start to finish that has amendments. That's not always possible, but that's kind of your starting point. And then there might be a handful of issues where we decide, let's take that out and put that on the side. If we were to do that with every single provision, you can imagine what chaos that would be.
Right.
Yeah, we shouldn't even be here.
But I mean, like, for stuff where we'd want, like, the non-contentious part still updated, would we include that as part of?
The big, long
Yeah.
document from start to finish
Yeah.
that the voters would either adopt, they'd vote in favor of it, they'd vote against it.
Okay.
So that is definitely something for everybody to think about as we go through this process. You got to think through how this particular provision is going to impact, the voters. Like the mayor said. I mean,
Yeah.
we go through this entire process, and to have it shot down because there's one issue that's just too controversial for people, then, this whole process was not necessarily all for naught, but definitely, obviously, all of your time expended, city staff's time expended, everybody, the cost of putting on the election, everything, so.
Gail.
Mayor, I've been through this before. I worked on the last revision, and I like the removing this out, doing the single, because we worked on this charter forever, and because of that issue is the reason it didn't pass before. So
Yeah, that's my main concern.
I don't wanna.
2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It doesn't. Most important thing is let's get, because the bulk of what we've done so far has been stellar. I mean, we've
Yeah.
gotten a lot of wordy stuff out. We're making it clear cut. I'd hate to see that go down,
Yeah.
because whether it's 2 years or 3 years, people are going to have to run again, eventually.
Yeah.
So, and I can see arguments on both sides. I get it, but Rich, you want to take us through, you got the whole next paragraph highlighted, and that's because we're moving it, or you need some questions answered?
Well, this obviously has to do with, as it's presently titled, the veto powers, as it's called here, of the mayor. And this actually, our thought was that this might make more sense to move to Article 5 regarding ordinances and elections. That said, we have included some proposed changes in this because this is actually a section that we've already been through.
Right.
So the idea would be to plug this into Article 5 regarding ordinances. And then, you know, I think it's important here to talk about what the word veto really means here. It's our opinion, the way this is structured, that this really does not give the mayor true veto powers, just to override an ordinance. It gives the mayor the ability to voice an objection, which can, you know, it can delay the enactment of an ordinance, but ultimately it's going to come before the commission again once that objection is posed, and the commission is going to revisit it. And we expanded that language in terms of when that comes before the commission if an objection is posed. We say within 30 days after the mayor timely poses an objection, as opposed to just a regular meeting. So there's some flexibility there. Could it be a special meeting? Could it be a regular meeting? What's the calendar look like in the upcoming 30 days? But really, and as I look at the proposed changes we have here, we would actually take it a step further and remove, if we go with the concept that's written in Section 14, we would actually recommend removing the word veto altogether, because that is somewhat of a misnomer, and replace it with something like objection or something like that throughout. And I see that it's obviously in the title of the section, and then we also see that again in the last third of the provision, where it says that if the city commission enacts the ordinance by 3 affirmative votes of the mayor vetoes and objects, or the mayor's veto and objections notwithstanding, we'd say just delete veto and the word and just leave it at mayor's objections. I don't know if everybody follows me on that, but that's what the essence is of this provision.
And then you're proposing to move it.
Move the whole thing.
And then move it to Article 5 ordinances.
Makes sense.
Everybody good with that?
Yes.
Got unanimous head nods, all right. Moving right along, Section 15.
15 will be everybody's favorite tonight, because the only thing we're recommending there is that it really just conform to some of the changes the very minor changes we made in some of the mayor sections. And we changed the word said to the,
Right.
a very non-substantive issue, but makes more sense because we do obviously know again what city we're talking about here.
Is that one of those we're going to break out separately, just in case the community can't wrap its mind about it? It could be. No, just.
This is definitely, we need
I'm
probably
sorry, it's
need
not a good time
right.
for sarcasm. My apologies.
This is another standalone issue here.
All right, where we get on 15? Mirror.
I'm
All right.
I'm good with it.
Great. 16.
16 is obviously, as you can see, what we'll call the quote-unquote old Section 16, because as we move provisions out, it renumbers everything. So we've got to be careful of which section we're really talking about here. But the current section, their old or current Section 16, really is probably something, after doing some research, and actually Judy did some research for us on this, and really what we confirmed with this is that the whole concept of canvassing is something that's left to not necessarily the city commission, but a board, and it is something that's enacted by ordinance rather than found in the city charters more times than not. So here we're recommending that we consider removing this altogether and putting it, maybe identifying it as an ordinance for the commission to consider. And you know, there's not a defined canvassing board in our city charter currently. What we have found is that oftentimes it's the mayor, the city clerk, and some other citizen appointed by the mayor that serves as the board to serve that function. So those are some things that we can probably address by ordinance.
Mr. Manager?
And just to piggyback on what Rich said, we do have ordinances on the books that define the makeup of the canvassing board. So this speaks to the canvassing board but doesn't define it. We have ordinances that define it. Judy did some research for us. 4 or 5 just close cities. We were just trying to define where does this typically wind up, and her conclusions were that it typically winds up in ordinances and not in charters.
Well, I think it's been another one of the themes of this committee that the things that we can move to ordinances should be moved to ordinances and pulled out of the charter, because it's easier for us to go back in, tweak ordinances, change ordinances than it is the whole charter. So I would agree with that. Does there anyone have a objection? Okay.
Objection
Seeing
at all.
none. Old 17, new 16. So is the question there just the wording about by resolution that we elect a pro?
Right,
Okay.
and I believe that as it's written, the city has, at least in recent times, enacted a resolution to this effect. But in terms of an administrative issue, if we were to remove the word by resolution, there would still be the obligation of city council to elect somebody to serve as the chairperson pro tempore and alternate, but it could be done by motion. We could do it by resolution too, but this just sort of takes a little bit of the formality out of it. It can be oftentimes or easily overlooked by a city or a municipality, and so this, at some point, there probably should at least be a motion to designate these individuals.
Don't we do that at every election? We make a motion, somebody, because it's always whoever's quickest to the mic to nominate someone else for that honor.
So are we looking to replace by resolution to by motion?
I would actually just
Or just
suggest
strike it at all?
removing it.
Just take it
Right.
out.
Okay.
Okay. Any thoughts on the election of the mayor pro tem?
I'm good with that.
Okay.
And then what we did with the old section 18 is actually combine that or merge it into the preceding section, just because it just seemed to flow a little bit better. It talks about what exactly are those roles for the person, whether it's the mayor or, in the absence of the mayor, the chairperson pro tempore. What are those functions to preside at the meetings? And we just changed some. You can see there's some fairly non-substantive changes just to make it consistent and clarify throughout in terms of the titles of these individuals.
I'm good with that.
Good. Questions? All right. Old 19, new 17.
There we go. The
Got
new
some
17.
Massive changes here.
I think that this is one where we made a communication error. And actually, one of the charter board members asked me a question and I responded one way, and then when she got her agenda packet, she saw it a different way. So we sent out a memo towards the end of the week that looked like this, and essentially it had three things for this board or this committee to consider. And the thought is being a 30-year reviewer of construction plans, the thing that I've always found is the easiest to miss is what's not there at all. So as we've been going through the charter, we see things in the charter that call our attention to and might need editing, changing. Those are easier to spot. The things that are missing altogether, or possibly be missing altogether, would be the easiest for staff or this board to overlook. So as we go through chapter by chapter, we've been meeting ahead of time, staff team, and one of our tasks is to look at a bunch of other charters and look at the League of Cities. The League of Cities has what they consider a model charter, to say these are the things that cities should consider including. So they got a whole list. And so we haven't run across that weren't in our charter that are in other people's charters prior till this one. So we get to City Commission, and we ran across three things that tend to show up in a lot of our other charters, or maybe the League of Cities model charter. So our position was to make this committee aware that there are some things out there that may not be in our charter. I want to be really clear that we are not advocating that they should be put in this charter, that it was just other cities have it, we don't, what do you think? So I think that we miscommunicated by going ahead and dropping them into this red line copy. Really what we thought we would do is say there are three issues. One is the commission will not interfere with staff hiring, which is, we kind of run by that. We talk about it from time to time, and really in the section, a late or subsequent chapter, where we define the duties and roles of the city manager, it explicitly says the city manager handles hiring, firing, those types of things. So adding this was simply, it's implicit in city commission and it's explicit under city manager. Most places that we were seeing, or several other places, made it explicit both places. So we were just simply saying, would you like to make it explicit in both places? So that's what's behind the one issue.
Shall we take them issue by issue, Mike?
Yeah, that would be fine to me. I guess I just wanted to make sure that we weren't being too presumptuous, or that you didn't get the impression that we were being presumptuous to suggest that these things should be in our charter. Our only should be is that we think this committee should be aware of these and then make up its own mind.
And I would say that in your backup material, there's a lot of different looks at those three. So I think Mike is right that it may have been presumptuous to pick one of those different models and drop it into here. The question really should probably be more to this document, and did you see one, let's talk about the idea, and then two, did you see one in here that you gravitated more towards than the one that staff put into this document? Ms. Jessica?
So I'm the person who contacted the city manager because I wanted some definitions, because that's the kind of person that I am. And one of the things that, because I went and actually looked at some of the charters for the hiring thing, because I'm somebody who deals with hiring and firing of staff in my position, and one of the questions I posed was, who defines what is interference with staff?
My question as well.
And what is defined as interference?
My question
Because
as well.
hiring and firing is pretty self-explanatory for most people. Obviously, if somebody goes, you must hire this person, we know what they mean. You must fire that person. But what is interference, and where's that line drawn? And then my next question, which I never got around back to emailing me back, was, and then what protections does the city manager have for the same thing? Because if he's bringing those concerns to the commission, he's also an at-will employee who has then no protections as well for his job that's politically, like, at the you know, of the commission. So, and then the other issue I had, because I think I thought all of the suggestions were fantastic ideas, that you're right, you don't understand the things that aren't there, that should be there, like selling utilities. Are we selling our utilities? No, probably not. But should it be in there? Yeah, it should. You know, one of the things about the Lake City is that it says any violation of a provision of this section by a member of the commission shall constitute grounds for removal from office. If we just leave it at that, what are grounds for removal from office?
Yeah, I didn't like that.
Lake
And what's
City,
the process?
Lake City lays it out, but we don't have that laid out. So would we have to lay that out somewhere? And Lake City, while they have it, it's very poorly drafted.
Very
So-
vague, very vague. I read it too.
And it has my like legal pet peeve of moral turpitude, so I don't like that at all. So, because that could be anything. So those were some of the issues that I had that I brought up with the city manager.
Well, while everyone is milling those questions over, Mike or Rich, could you talk to the committee about specifically, because the question I have about all three of these is that it seems to be a divergence upon what has been a theme of this review, which has been everything that should be done by resolution or ordinance should be pulled out of the charter and shouldn't be embedded in the charter.
Right.
And all three of these things seem wonderful issues that we should probably have ordinances on. But why are we switching gears? Because not 30 seconds ago we were talking about, well, that seems like an ordinance issue, not a charter issue. What is special about these three issues that make them charter worthy, and they shouldn't just be ordinances that should be brought before the commission so that we could hash out all of those questions?
Well, let me say this, and I'll echo a bit of what the city manager has already said, but these actually, I will actually say that the city attorney put these in here to just demonstrate what it would look like if it's in here. I can definitely agree with some of the concerns here that I think in each of the three cases, this is not ready as drafted, and I do believe that there would have to be, if we were to even entertain including these three concepts, there would have to be more work done to define some of the terms, and I don't think there's any...
Which is the whole point about doing it in an ordinance,
Right.
not in charter.
You make an excellent observation yourself. And again, I mean, I think what we were just trying to do here is just show you what other charters have, not necessarily say that this is the right way to do it. We included this just for consideration of what some of the other charters have done. But just like in our conversation a few minutes ago, we showed you how some of the charters address the canvassing, or they do not address the canvassing board. It's addressed by ordinance. So that's really, we're just sort of showing you what is sort of a bit of a, I guess you could say. There's not any reason why these three items here could not necessarily be handled by ordinance.
And would it seems to me like up until tonight, your preference and your advice to the board, this board, has been to pull everything out of the charter that should be done by ordinance and do it by ordinance. Is that where you would come down on these three things as well, that it should be done by ordinance? If that's so, then we could reduce a lot of our conversation here tonight. We'll just pull all three of these things out. We'll direct the city manager to bring all three of them up to the commission in some form of ordinance, and then we don't have to spend the next hour and a half hashing over something that at the end of the day, we're going to say, you know what, guys, all three of those things are great ideas, but they all should be done by ordinance. They shouldn't be in the charter.
Well, I think, for instance,
I'm just trying to think of the timing here.
on the staff hiring issue, I think the reason it's probably worth some discussion here right now, as far as whether to include or not include, is I do think elsewhere in the charter it talks about what the city manager can do. And so this would be a natural place to not necessarily rely on, by implication, the city commission cannot do, but address it specifically so there's some consistency with other parts of the chart. That would be, I'm not necessarily advocating that it should be in here, but that would be a reason to include it.
If you, on that point, if you just pull out that last line, I think it becomes a lot less controversial. That any violation of a provision of this section by members shall constitute grounds for removal from office. Because once I put it in the charter, that I have a way to remove it, I have a way to overturn the will of the people based on interference. Now I got to get real precise with what does that mean? What does interference look like?
What does removal from office look like?
What does removal from office look like? All those kind of, I mean, the rest of this is just sort of clearing. I mean, I would just say that first line, city commission shall not interfere with staff hiring or firing. They now have explicitly stated it in, and I've explicitly stated it, in the commission, I've explicitly stated it in the manager's section. The rest of that is just kind of throat clearing in my mind of going through what that might look like, but it could also look like an infinite number of other things, you know?
I'm thinking that,
Has this happened before? I mean, is there a problem in the city of Newberry with the commission? I mean, this is really, is there a problem with the commission overstepping you, Mike?
No.
Maybe we should let Rich answer this way.
What I would say too is, there's nothing in here that is intended in any way to be directed towards a specific situation.
Okay.
This is just
something to add.
I can assure
Yeah,
you,
they were
this
just
is
saying
included
this
by
is just
this.
something to think about if we wanted to
This
add
is,
it.
this is food for thought for the board and have
Right.
some great dialogue on
Yeah, because
why
I'll
or
tell
why
you,
not.
the one
And-
that I really did not care for was the second point on the part about no commissioner shall be hired within a year.
Well, and we
I
have,
strongly disagree with that one. So if we were discussed about that, I'll let y'all know where I stand already on that.
we have an ordinance, don't we, that for things not to be named after a commissioner or
Streets not to be
mayor
named, it's a
after
policy,
a certain number of years.
and we ignore it.
Yeah, I know. That's actually the point I brought up to the city
Right.
manager too.
Yeah.
I'm still thinking that our job up here is to try to simplify our charter
Yeah.
instead of loading more stuff into it. I like the mayor's suggestion of just running, if you're going to put anything about hiring in there, this is pretty clear cut. City commission shall not interfere with staff hiring.
Period.
The rest of it, it's just going into the weeds. I mean, that's just how I see it. It's just defining
And it-
something that doesn't need
Yeah, I
to be
mean, I think if
defined
you're
in the
gonna,
charter.
when you're adding all these extra paragraphs and stuff, you're almost opening it up, I think, for an issue.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just have one sentence, city commission shall not interfere with staff hiring, I mean, that's why we have the system that we have.
Right.
I mean, if the
It-
commission wants to be involved with hiring and firing, then why do we have a city manager?
If these are legitimate issues, they should be done through ordinance. I mean, I don't.
And I think
see-
all three of these are good ideas to
Oh,
bring in
they're
front of the commission.
fantastic ideas.
Yeah.
But I don't see them in the charter.
Okay, do I have a head nod that these would be better as ordinances? We'll pull all those
Yes.
three sections out,
Yep.
and we'll move to,
Yes.
Well, can we
Forfeiture.
leave the one
You wanna leave
line
the
that
line?
says city commission shall not interfere with staff hiring?
No.
No?
I mean,
Okay.
it is stated in another place that the city manager has all power to hire, fire the
Okay.
employees. So this is kind of mirroring the language, and I don't think anyone would object to that, but it is already stated in the city manager.
Yeah, it's just like U.S.
Section.
Constitution, the legislative branch has all powers to make laws.
Yeah.
Not the president, not the judicial.
So we'll pull
So it
these
doesn't
three
need to be in
sections
there.
out. Would this board empower me to take these three items to the commission and say, hey, in the charter review, staff came up with some things that our other cities are doing, but they believe should be done by ordinance, and the charter advises that we look at those things as ordinances.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move right on then to,
Could I make?
But
a-
I mean, not necessarily, because weren't we just told that these were not things that were suggested by the city? They were just letting us know that
Right.
these things are out there. So from what I'm getting is city staff is not saying, we would like these things in there. They're just saying, hey.
no, what
this is
I
what's out
asked
there.
for is this board thinks that these are important enough that this board would suggest that the commission look at it, not approve it, just look at them.
Yeah.
Not whether staff says.
I would want the
Yeah, I mean,
city
you can discuss
commission to
anything,
discuss
sure.
it
Discuss
and
Halloween.
let them make the determination as to whether they want to create an ordinance.
Yeah.
Okay.
What-
If
One
Jessica-
one other thing I'll.
We're losing decorum. I'm sorry. I'm doing a bad job. I'm doing a bad job as the chair.
It's in
Hang
your
on, let
charter.
Miss Jessica
No,
have
go ahead.
the
No.
floor. Oh, very nice.
Go
You can
ahead.
let
I
Rich talk.
appreciate that. Mr. Mayor, what I was going to say too is this also gets back to our discussion a few minutes ago about standalone provisions. There's the concept of pulling it out and putting it in an ordinance. There's also the concept of doing it as a standalone provision. if there's
No, let's
any
not do
interest.
that. Miss Jessica.
What do we have on the book so far about the only concern I have is with the utility and the 2/3 voter referendum
And
for
I-
selling. What do we have on the book
There was
right
actually
now
a-
that has anything to do with that?
An excellent, see, right now, nothing, but really like Mount Doris. Mount Doris simply says that you have to notice it and it has to pass through 2 readings of the ordinance. To me, that makes sense, that if you're gonna make a big decision, it should be advertised, which we do that already anyway. I think technically speaking, staff's concern is that someone could come in and offer us a bunch of money and we can make a decision on the fly. I've never seen the commission vote on something that wasn't on the agenda as a properly agended item to vote on. But Mount Doris simply says you gotta do the 2 readings, which would give everyone time, that would slow the process down. Now, I know the city manager has strong feelings about this one. I'm gonna go back to the stance that, you know, that's a wonderful issue to bring to the commission's attention as an ordinance, not necessarily as a charter provision, but he's got some thoughts on it.
Well, and Mr. Mayor, I would say, particularly with the regards to the, to any of these issues, but particularly the one with regards to selling a utility, it's been 12 years ago, I think, or 10 years ago, that the city of Newberry sold its cable TV system. And the commission made that decision after a lot of deliberation. And I come to Newberry some 6, 7 years later, and there's not a quarter that goes by that someone doesn't walk up to this podium and make some disparaging comment about how did we let that happen. And this came, it's been maybe 10, 12 years ago, a commission voted to sell the electric utility, and they eventually accomplished that. It took 12 years worth of legal battles, but when that initially happened, the population was against it. And after 12 years of legal battles, they kind of straightened it all out. But if it is an ordinance, as you suggest, well, I think if it's in the charter, the commission simply shrugs and says, this is a big decision and it should go to the will of the people. You know, it's just bigger than us. If it's an ordinance, it is opportune for the commission to innocuously change an ordinance in 2 readings that just speaks to some unnamed, just says we're going to get rid of that ordinance, it doesn't apply, and then very quickly sell our cable system with one notice, even if it's noticed, one notice meeting. So I introduced this and said we don't feel strongly, and I really think it's important that this committee say this is what we think. But I think it is worth stating that I think it shows up in other people's charter because they're big gravity issues that might be bigger. Our electric utility is worth $40 or $50 million, and significantly more than our cable TV system would have ever been worth. And it's a big deal. I think that it's something that the commission, this committee, staff should always consider about who's making the final decision on whether we do that or not.
We also have a rolling 30-year contract with FMPA that from the moment we say we want out of that contract, we can't get out of it for 30 years until after that. So, I mean, I take the city manager's point here, but to me, once it's in the charter, it becomes something that you're bound to do. And if there's an opportunity, that comment about selling the cable company, I also get lots of comments that was from the people who did it, that said, guys, that was the right call to make in that moment. I mean, there was aging infrastructure. We were going to have to spend $1 million. So there's going to always be people on both sides of an issue. And if you say that you got to go to a referendum, and you bind the process, now you got to have the vote again. There may be time sensitivities. It seems like something that should be hashed, because we're going to get into a lot of weeds on this issue. And my understanding from legal was the charter's not the place to do that. That when you have something that you got to get into the weeds, that's where you want to do it in ordinances. That way, if you get one of those weeds wrong, you can tweak the weed and not have to do an entire charter review to change it. Dallas, you have strong feelings about this one too.
Well, staff doesn't advocate for things, but I'm going to advocate for this. Only from
Sure looks like it.
Only from a financial standpoint, just so the board is aware, there could be benefits in our debt options. Putting a provision like this in our charter, because it would give our debtors, people we owe debt to, more confidence in the ability for the utility to maintain itself. So I just wanted to put that out there. There is a financial benefit to putting in the charter, but it'd be better than what we are, but it's not going to be detrimental.
Okay.
Are we that much in debt, Dallas, that we got to?
Water wastewater system has about $4 million.
I was being facetious.
And I don't think it's our current debt, it's our ability to get future debt. It makes a bondholder feel more confident. I guess I just want to close out one thing on what's proposed in here. We very purposely changed it from selling our electric utility to changing significant infrastructure, because the electric utility is our biggest valued infrastructure, but it could apply to a water treatment system, a wastewater treatment system. It could, Champions Park. So there may be a dollar threshold, but then the wording down in there was another one of those, let's just grab the first one on the list and pull it in there and show what it would look like. I'm not suggesting that it should be a 2/3 vote. I'm not suggesting that it should be electric utility only. And with regards to major infrastructure, the electric utility is the only system where we have a 30-year moving contract that makes it difficult to sell an electric utility. I would mention to you that the city of Vero Beach that recently sold its electric utility was in that same 30-year agreement, and they managed to work through that. So
It cost them $168 million
in the
buy
end,
themselves out of that. So
in the end, their taxpayers are
probably not
going to
gonna
lose.
be-
Their
yeah.
electric utility payers are going to lose as a result of that. But they got so far down the road, they just said, "The heck with it, let's do it."
to me, far from being a reason to put it in the charter, that's another reason not to put it in the charter, because that's another one of those weeds. What counts as significant infrastructure? And now I've got to start figuring out, is the fire department significant infrastructure? Is Champions Park significant infrastructure? What counts as significant and all of those are good questions, but they're all questions that we want to have the ability to admit that we got it a little bit wrong, and we're going to tweak an ordinance, not go back and do a whole charter again. So I think these are, and like I said, all three of these are worth the commission's attention. They're all, I think, worthwhile for us to talk about. I think they're intensely problematic in the actual charter. Do I have a head nod in agreement with that? I mean, we can spend the next 2 hours hashing them out if you guys, if y'all want to.
I'm still under the agreement that we don't need to load it up.
Okay, so we'll remove these three. I'll advise the commission that we had these conversations and that this should be something that they should look at. And we will move to forfeiture of office. Rich?
So the forfeiture of office, again, we point this out for discussion. it currently reads that any commissioner or the mayor could potentially be removed from office or forfeit office upon the absence from 4 consecutive regular meetings, and that's a loaded phrase there. We could leave it as is because we're happy with it, but this would also be the time to talk about or think about, is 4 the right number? Should they be consecutive meetings? And are we limited to regular meetings, or should it also include special meetings, emergency meetings, things of that sort? All open for discussion. I will also say, too, in reviewing several of the other charters, I would suggest that the city of Newberry is already ahead of the game here, because a lot of the charters don't even have this provision. I will just tell you, speaking from a private corporate standpoint, you often see provisions like this written into the bylaws of a corporation for board members. So that's sort of what this seems to be tracking here, whereas a lot of the other charters, we don't even see it addressed at all, which absenteeism obviously could be very problematic for a municipality, so it's something to at least talk about.
If you read the whole thing, though, if you get down here, this is really it would be between the dais, because it says if they're excused. So it wouldn't matter how many they really miss, as long as they're excused by the members of the board.
That's a fair point.
So, for me, I don't think it's worth discussing.
I mean, it came up recently. Is it 3 right now?
No, it's 4
It's 4.
right
It's
now.
still 4 right now. And, you know, I think the excusal is that generally when a commissioner misses, it's a very legitimate reason. We've had family issues, you know, everybody schedules a vacation at some point. I mean, I think it probably regular meetings, because those are at least on the schedule.
Yes.
So if you miss 4 of those, that's 2 months of city business you've missed. And then that at least gives the commission the opportunity to say, there was nothing here. You're just not doing your job.
Y'all know as the commission
Right.
if it's good or bad.
And you just excuse
That's
it.
what y'all are elected for.
Right. And that's what we did. We just excused the beast. So, I mean, I'm comfortable with the way it is. I think
I'm
4 at that
comfortable.
point is kind of egregious. You missed two solid months of business. And it does give the commission a chance to say, if someone is just going on vacation all the time, or just not showing up, they just don't want to be here, you know, it gives the commission a chance to say, the other commissioners anyway, a chance to hold them accountable and say, you got to do the work, you know, part of it. Everybody good with 4?
Yeah.
And consecutive meetings?
Consecutive,
Regular
regular
meetings.
meetings.
Right, regular meetings.
And most of the organizations that I've been a part of, that is one of the bylaws. I mean, that's, you know, it's usually always 4 consecutive regular meetings. And I think it's a good standard.
Okay. All right. 19, commission meetings.
Commission meetings, what we've tried to do here is, in general, maybe make it a little bit easier to call meetings, not necessarily suggesting that it should be easier, but or that by calling a meeting, the commission is forced to make a decision on anything, or vote in a certain way. But for instance, in subpart B, special meetings, instead of having 2 commissioners have to sort of join forces, which also raises some sunshine issues, we reduced it to 1 member of the commission, and we throughout inserted the ability of the city manager to also call a meeting. Again, it's not suggesting that the commission has to take any action, but it at least puts the commission in a position where they would have to meet and at least talk about whether they are going to take some action on something.
That 2-member thing has always been problematic, because how would 2 commission meetings? I mean, the whole idea, we've never done it that way. And for me, if a commissioner says, hey, I think we need to have a meeting on this, I just call the meeting. You know, it's you have to call on somebody else. So, you know, I don't, the only thing I see here is the potential for us to just have a whole lot of extra special meetings, because, you know, anybody can call them, but I doubt that anybody wants to have more meetings, you know.
I was about to say, I'm sure that won't be.
It'll be Monty. Monty, you know that guy loves to have some meetings. Every Thursday night, we'll be having a special meeting. Okay?
Only if he wears a special
we-
suit.
I was gonna say, the change from the 2 members to any member, it does kind of, well, I don't know how the sunshine law would have played into that, because usually they're talking directly to either you or the city manager
To call it.
to call it. I mean, they're not generally talking amongst themselves to call it, but
No, they couldn't talk amongst themselves. So they would have to either call me
Yeah.
or just call Mike himself and say, hey, we
But see,
want to have a,
That's what so I think maybe striking 2 and putting any member, because, you know, that way, that's all they gotta do is talk to you guys, and it eliminates the potential of discussing between themselves, amongst themselves.
yeah. Yeah. The, any omission or irregularity, and what's the question there, Rich?
Let's see.
So what if the city clerk is not present?
Well, I
Maybe a
think,
designee.
I think the way, we may need to clarify that the city clerk should always be present. I think it does say elsewhere, I think we cited section 42, that the city clerk must be present. We probably want to avoid a situation where the city clerk is not here and somebody contends that there is, that's an irregularity that we can get past, when elsewhere in the charter it requires the city clerk to actually be there, unless we can come up with some creative way.
So you're saying we can have a designee, or we cannot have it? Which one?
Oh, that's what I was gonna ask. I was gonna ask, is there a stand-in for if Judy can't make a meeting?
That's it, that's the question.
Right now, I don't think there's that ability.
Because usually if we're calling a special meeting, there's a time sensitivity. So if Miss Judy is out of the country, and we need to have that special meeting tomorrow, you're saying we can't have a...
We could include language to make it very clear that we could
Have
designate
it
somebody.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think there's always got to be a backup. Mike?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor, in the day, when charters were being created, we didn't have the ability to have the electronic versions. I think the most crucial thing in order to comply with state law is that we have to have meeting minutes. That's a
Right.
requirement. The clerk is tasked with that. But now with electronic technology, we could have a stand-in and still comply with state law. We could record it without having a stand-in and produce minutes just fine. So I was thinking last week when we were discussing this that we were fine that the real regulation needs to be that we produce minutes, not who's in attendance. That it's recorded.
Right.
In
Because we've
some way,
had
shape, or
commission
form.
meetings where Miss Judy was sick.
That's
and
correct.
Amy stood in and took the meeting.
That's
And with
correct.
the recording, you could always take the minutes afterwards by just
That's-
watching the
That's
meeting.
correct.
I think there's a provision where the city attorney can go back, we can work
Okay,
on this.
just
to
work
make
on
sure
that
there's some
language
good-
there.
Good, strong language to make it clear that we have those options.
Okay. Anything else in that about the special meeting? We can only vote on what the special meeting was called for. It's an emergency, 3 hours notice. D, workshop. Any questions there? Just designating between meetings where you're going to take a vote, workshop where you're spreading information, and emergencies where immediate action can be needed. Is that?
Like towns burning.
Yeah.
About someone else in the world.
I'm good with everything else. Just my concern is making sure we have somebody in a special meeting to stand in
What happened to
for
conference
Miss
session?
Judy.
Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead, Madam Clerk. And your assistant is not designated as a deputy, they're just an assistant.
When this charter was revised, they,
That's what he was
their
gonna,
new purpose came out.
he was gonna be conference session.
So that's, because this is probably
You may wanna point that out. I will.
business here.
A holdover from that.
Change.
I got you.
Say, or designate, or someone designated.
Okay. Rich?
I do want to clarify one thing, and I apologize, speaking with the city manager about this. The next section, section 20, which would be the new section 20, the very last sentence says the city commission may meet in conference session at a place other than the regular meeting place, but no official action shall be taken at such conference meeting. The intent would have been here to put this up as, in section 19 as subpart E, as another type of meeting that takes place in addition to the regular, special, emergency, and workshops. And then, if we were to do that, and that identifies all the different types of meetings that could take place, we probably need to have some discussion about what, I mean, should we prohibit there, being any official action from being taken? Or do we see some situations where we would actually want to be able to have that flexibility? And
I had that question about that section, so if it's appropriate to bring that up
Absolutely.
now. I mean, if a sinkhole opens up underneath City Hall and there's a whole bunch of them around the town, and we've got to have an emergency meeting, and we can't meet here, but we can't legally take action anyplace other than here, how does that work? If this half of the city's on fire and we can't get to City Hall, how do we, I mean, what constitutes falling into a state of emergency where the manager just has state of emergency powers and where we would actually need to have an emergency meeting, but we couldn't get into this place, but we needed to take action?
And I guess to Mr. Mayor and to the whole board, apologize for maybe a little bit of not being completely on the same page. This was a really long chapter when we went through it. My recollection is that this commission, or our commission, Newberry's commission, actually has moved in not the distance past meetings that where they anticipated the crowds were going to be really, really big to other places and then made decisions.
Man, Oakview,
And in my
Easton.
experience, that's completely appropriate, language in the charter notwithstanding. And we haven't done it since I've been here, but we've at least had the conversation, is this going to get big enough that we should consider moving it to a venue that will hold all these people, with the underlying thought being, it's important to get all the people into the meeting. If people show up to a public meeting and they feel like there's not going to be an opportunity to get their voices, then we feel like we've missed the entire purpose of why you have public meetings. So
Why don't we just strike the line?
yeah, my suggestion is that we not require that only decisions be made in this. Maybe
If
some
you're not
language.
violating any laws, Mike, what's it matter where they meet?
Right.
I'm in
I'm with you.
agreement with that.
I very much am in agreement with that, and I would like the opportunity to bring that back, bring some language back next time to make sure that we have the flexibility to hold those types of meetings.
Absolutely.
Well, what I'm
Well-
reading into that is, because up in the first line of this, it talks about special meetings may be held elsewhere in the city under authority of a resolution previously adopted authorizing such a meeting, which gives the board the ability to go elsewhere already. It already exists, to be able to have a meeting and make decisions. This line, the last line in this, reminds me of the issue we had with the Alachua County Commission having meetings before the meetings, where they actually made decisions where they weren't supposed to. And it tends to violate sunshine, and that's how I'm reading that line.
If it does not break the law, that's what I was saying. If it does not break the law, what's it matter where they meet? They're not gonna go somewhere else and make a decision that violates the law.
We
Correct,
can't,
but that's
so-
already up in this first sentence.
Yeah.
right, so that's why we're
It's
saying just
already
strike it out.
authorized.
Just strike it out.
Just strike that line completely,
Yeah.
You can.
That's
because
what
I don't want to authorize meetings before the meetings. You know, where,
I mean, all of our meetings where you take a vote have to be agended, right? You have to have someone taking the minutes, all those kinds of things, and you have to
Being
let
right
folks
here
know.
don't mean, this
Right.
doesn't mean it has to be right here at this dais.
correct, and that's
I think
that's
we're all
spelled
saying
out
the
in the
same
first
thing.
sentence.
I think we're all saying the same thing.
Yes.
Okay,
Strike it out, as long as
Okay.
it don't break the law.
all right. All right, so did that take care of 20? Because we kind of skipped, we were in 19 and we skipped into 20, but I
That-
feel
that-
like we've,
That's correct.
feel like we've covered 20 pretty good now. New 20, I'm sorry, new 20.
New 20, the deleted language is removed just because it's very redundant of what's in section 18, and now I have to make sure it's the old 18 or the new 18.
Right. Okay, so we did,
It was
we
the-
didn't talk about E in 19 because we got into that last line. Is everybody good with E in new 19? Okay, conduct
And
of
that is
meetings.
not new language, actually. That was, I believe that was moved up from
A
one of
different
those
section.
last two sections.
It reads very familiar to me.
Yeah, it's actually in
Okay.
new 20, but they struck it and moved it up.
And we've talked about 20, new 20, so we're on to new 21. Quorum, minimum votes necessary to adopt ordinance or resolution. Pretty straightforward, you need a quorum.
Yep.
Quorum means,
We-
legal, have it, Rich, you got
we-
anything in particular there you
Well,
want?
just to summarize, we removed the ability of commissioners to discipline others, just because there's no quorum. The thought being, if there's no quorum, then there's just no meeting.
Right.
There's no, commissioners,
Correct.
right,
You
commissioners
can't
don't
take
necessarily have
action.
the power to punish fellow commissioners.
Okay,
I like that.
We were having fun with the concept.
and does that bring us,
That
To
looks like the
conclusion.
end.
all right, well done. Okay, so we have the notes of everything that we've talked about today. Do we need a vote to send you back to that, Rich? Or do you want to wait till you bring us back all of the notes?
Well, I would suggest we have a motion that adopts our discussion today to direct the city attorney to go back and make the changes that were discussed.
Okay.
I won't say that part of that motion should be somebody needs to summarize all those changes.
Thank you, appreciate that. Do I have that motion?
So moved.
I have a motion from Walt and a second from Mark. Any questions on the motion on the floor? They're going to bring us back this next time. Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Jim, you have any comments?
Nope.
Ms. Gail, you got any comments? Ms. Monty? Ms. Jessica? Mark?
No.
Walt?
Make sure you overeat, stuff yourself, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Mark? Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I have no comments.